The engine sat dead under the work lights, $3 million of titanium and carbon fiber that 12 engineers had already given up on. Their reports were stacked on the desk in a neat, damning row, every signature landing on the same conclusion. Daniel Ashford pushed his cleaning cart past the open bay, then stopped mid-stride, one wheel still turning. He set down his rag. He walked toward the engine the way a man walks toward an old friend's hospital bed, unhurried, careful, and he laid his palm flat against the cowling, listening for something the diagnostic software had never once caught. Would you have looked twice at the man in the coveralls? Some of the smartest people in any room are the ones nobody bothers to ask. Nobody at Whitfield Propulsion Systems noticed Daniel Ashford, and that was, in its way, exactly the point. He fixed the leaking faucet in the third-floor break room without anyone learning his name, tightened it in 90 seconds, while 2 engineers stepped around him to reach the coffee machine. He replaced fluorescent tubes in the engineering wing, while 2 junior staff argued past him about thrust vectoring, as if he were a piece of the wall, their voices carrying over his head like he wasn't standing directly between them. He wore the same navy coveralls every day, Ashford stitched over the left pocket in faded red thread, and he moved through the building the way a man moves when he has made himself small on purpose, taking up as little space as the job would allow. He had worked at Whitfield for 2 years and 8 months. In that time, he had never once been invited to a company meeting, never eaten lunch in the cafeteria, never been asked a technical question by anyone with an engineering degree hanging on their office wall. He preferred it that way. Visibility, in his experience, cost things. It cost time. It cost the parts of a life that mattered most. He kept a small toolbox in the bed of his truck that had nothing to do with his job description, wrenches and calipers worn smooth from another life, and some mornings before his shift started, he'd sit in the cab with the door open and just look at it in the way a man looks at a locked room in a house he still lives in. He never opened it at work. That had been the whole arrangement, the entire deal he'd made with himself the day he handed in his resignation letter from a job with a badge and a clearance number, and he had kept that deal for 2 years and 8 months without breaking it once. At 12:15, he ate lunch in his truck in the far corner of the lot, engine off, windows cracked, and his daughter Lily climbed in beside him after the elementary school bus dropped her at the corner, dropping her backpack on the floor mat, still in her uniform from Riverbend Elementary, the collar slightly crooked the way it always was by midday. She unwrapped her sandwich and told him, in great and looping detail, about a science fair project on magnets, how iron filings would jump toward a horseshoe magnet if you sprinkled them just right, and he listened the way he listened to everything that mattered, completely, without checking his phone once, without letting his eyes drift to the clock on the dash. This was the good part of the day. He kept it separate from the rest of it, the way a man keeps a locked drawer separate from an open house, and for 40 minutes, nothing else in the world was allowed in. Upstairs, in a conference room with a long view of the Huntsville skyline and the low green hills beyond it, Claire Whitfield sat across from a table of men twice her age, most of whom had been sitting in that same room since before she was born. Her father was in Crestwood Medical recovering from a second surgery on his heart, and in his absence, she was running Whitfield Propulsion on borrowed authority that nobody at the table had fully agreed to lend her. Gordon Reyes, chairman of the board, tapped a folder against the table twice, a small habitual gesture that had come, over the years, to mean he was about to say something he considered final. 10 days, he said. The department contract lapses if that engine doesn't run clean by the demonstration date. 12 of our best people have already told you, in writing, that it can't be fixed. At some point, Claire, we have to accept what our own engineers are telling us. Then we find a 13th opinion, Claire said, and the room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when someone says something no one at the table expects to be taken seriously. There is no 13th opinion, Gordon said. There's the department we already have, and the department has spoken. Then I'll look somewhere else in the building, Claire said, and stood before he could answer her. Later that afternoon, Daniel walked past the testing bay with a bag of replacement bulbs under his arm and slowed without meaning to, the way a man slows near a sound he half recognizes. Through the glass, he could see Claire and the engineering lead, Walter Higgins, standing over a schematic taped to the wall, the compressor stage circled in red marker 3 separate times, each circle a little more frustrated than the last. Daniel's eyes moved across the blueprint the way another man's eyes might move across a familiar street he hadn't walked down in years. He kept walking, but something in his jaw had tightened, and it stayed tight the rest of the day, through the rest of his rounds, through the drive home, through dinner, until Lily asked him if he was okay, and he told her he was just tired. That night Walter Higgins left the testing bay unlocked. He told himself it was an oversight, the kind a man in his 60s was entitled to after a 14-hour day chasing a problem that refused to explain itself. He told himself the filing cabinet with the classified propulsion archives had simply slipped his mind too, that he'd meant to lock it and gotten pulled into something else. He did not examine either thought any further than that. He had been doing this job for 31 years, long enough to trust an instinct even when he couldn't name where it came from. Daniel came back a little after 11. He had told Lily's sitter he'd be late without saying why, because he didn't fully know why himself yet, only that something in him had been circling the problem all evening like a dog that couldn't settle. He stood in front of the engine for a long time before he touched it, arms crossed, studying it the way you'd study a person you hadn't seen in a decade, and when he finally opened the access panel, his hands moved with a certainty that had nothing to do with a maintenance man's training. He did not reach for the diagnostic tablet mounted on the cart beside him. He used a penlight, a small mirror on a telescoping rod, and his own fingers, working through the compressor housing the way a surgeon works through tissue he has mapped 100 times before, patient, unhurried, listening more than looking. An hour in, he reached into his own toolbox for a wrench that wasn't company property, and a small leather notebook, worn soft at the corners, slid out onto the concrete floor. It fell open to a page of diagrams and cramped handwritten notation. Walter, who had come back for a jacket he'd left behind and stopped cold in the doorway when he saw the lights still on, saw the pages before Daniel did. He recognized the notation immediately. He recognized the signature block in the corner even faster, because he had spent 3 years of his own career chasing rumors about the engineer behind it, a name that had simply vanished from the aerospace world 9 years ago, as if the ground had opened up and swallowed him whole. Walter said nothing at first. Daniel looked up, saw him standing there in the doorway, and for a long moment neither man moved, the silence stretching taut between them like something that might snap if either of them spoke too loudly into it. Then Walter turned and walked out without a word, leaving the door open behind him, and Daniel sat back on his heels in the empty bay, with the notebook resting in his open palm. He thought, briefly, about closing it and putting it away and never coming back to this building at all. Instead, he pulled his wife's photograph from his wallet, the one he still carried though the edges had gone soft with 9 years of handling, and he held it for a while under the work lights, turning it slightly to catch the light better, the way you'd tilt something you were trying to remember correctly. "I just wanted to fix it," he said quietly, "to no one, to her, to the empty bay, that's all. Then I was going to go home and nobody was ever going to know." By 7 the next morning, Claire was standing over the open engine with her coffee going cold in her hand, staring at handwritten notation in the margins of an overnight diagnostic printout, symbols she recognized dimly from her father's era, but that no engineer currently on her payroll used anymore. Careful hand-drawn arrows where a modern report would have run a color-coded graph. She pulled the overnight security footage before she'd finished her coffee. The camera in the testing bay caught a figure at 11:40, grainy, unmistakable, even at that resolution in the Navy coveralls. She had Daniel called up to her office by 9, and he stood on the other side of her desk with his hands loose at his sides, not defensive, not apologetic either, just still, the way he stood everywhere, like a man who had long ago stopped needing to fill a room with anything extra. "That bay is restricted after hours," she said. "I could have you walked out of this building in the next 5 minutes, and most people in my position would." "I know," Daniel said. "I wasn't trying to hide it. I just didn't know how else to look at it without someone stopping me before I finished." "Finished what, exactly?" "Finding out why it stalls at 80% thrust instead of 94. Your bleed valve timing is off by a fraction most diagnostic software would read as noise and throw out. You'd feel it with your hands before you'd ever see it clean on a screen." Claire set her coffee down slowly, studying him the way she might study a stranger who had just finished her sentence for her. It was the specificity that stopped her. The offhand certainty of a man who wasn't guessing, who spoke about a $3 million engine, the way most people spoke about their own car. She studied him for a long moment. The quiet, the stillness, the way he didn't rush to fill silence, the way most men in this building filled every silence they were ever given, as if talking more made them sound more certain. 48 hours, she said finally. You don't touch anything the 12 engineers already logged without me in the room while you do it. And this doesn't leave this office yet, not until I understand what I'm actually looking at." Daniel nodded once. Understood. He turned to go, and at the door he stopped, his hand resting on the frame. "For what it's worth," he said, not turning back around, "your father would have caught that valve timing in 10 minutes. He trained good people here. They're just looking at screens instead of listening to the machine." He left before she could think of anything to say back to that, and she sat with the silence he left behind for longer than she meant to. The 48 hours became 4 nights, because that was how long it actually took to do it right. And Claire stayed for all of them, telling herself each time that she was only supervising, only making sure the terms of the arrangement were honored. She sat on an overturned crate with a laptop balanced on her knees while Daniel worked, the bay lit by a single bank of overhead lights, the rest of the building dark and silent around them like a held breath. Somewhere around 1 in the morning on the 3rd night, she asked him about the girl who called his cell phone every evening at exactly 7, a habit she'd noticed without meaning to. "My daughter," Daniel said, not looking up from the panel he was tracing with his fingers. "Lily. She's 9. Calls every night at 7 whether I'm home or not, just to check." "And her mother?" "Cancer. 3 years ago this spring." He said it the way a man says something he has already grieved all the way through, flat and clean, no request for sympathy folded into it. The way you'd report a fact about the weather. "I used to travel for work, weeks at a time, sometimes longer. After she died, I couldn't do that anymore. Lily needed someone home every night, not flying out on a Tuesday and back on a Friday if she was lucky, and even then half asleep at the dinner table from jet lag." Claire didn't ask what the work had been. She had a feeling she already half knew, sitting there watching his hands move through a compressor housing like they belonged there, and she wasn't ready yet to hear it confirmed out loud. "Does she know?" Claire asked instead. "What you're doing here at night?" "She knows I'm helping fix something. That's all she needs to know at 9. Daniel set down a socket wrench and looked at her for the first time in several minutes. "I made a promise to her, after her mother died, that I'd never be the kind of tired that doesn't come home. Every decision I make, I run it through that first." "That's not a small promise to keep." "No," he said, "it isn't. Most days it's the only thing keeping me honest." Gordon Reyes found them there a few minutes past midnight, drawn by the lit bay when the rest of the floor was dark and quiet. He stood in the doorway with his coat still buttoned, looking at Claire perched on a crate beside a man in maintenance coveralls, and something in his expression settled into a shape Claire didn't like at all. "Long night, Claire," he said, each word measured. "You do understand what this looks like, you, spending your evenings down here with facilities staff instead of the engineering team. I'm paying 6 figures a year to solve this." "He's the only one who's made real progress in 10 days, Gordon. Make sure that's still demonstrably true tomorrow morning." Gordon looked at Daniel then, properly, for the first time, a long, assessing look that traveled from his coveralls to his hands to his face, and lingered there a beat too long, as if trying to place him. Then he left without another word, his footsteps fading down the empty hallway. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. Daniel went back to the compressor housing, his shoulders a little more set than they'd been a minute before. Claire watched him work, watched the careful, deliberate way he handled every component like it mattered whether it was ever thanked for its trouble. And something had shifted quietly in the space between them, something neither of them had a name for yet, and neither of them reached a name that night. It was past 2 in the morning when Daniel finally found it. A manufacturing tolerance stacked wrong in the second-stage compressor blade, a flaw so small that every diagnostic system in the building had read it as background noise and thrown it out of the analysis without a second look. He sat back on his heels and let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 4 straight nights. "That's it," he said. "That's the whole problem, right there." Claire came and stood beside him and looked at the mark he'd made on the blade edge with a grease pencil, a circle no bigger than a dime, small enough to disappear under a thumbnail. $3 million and 12 engineers with advanced degrees, and the answer had been the size of a fingernail the entire time, hiding in plain sight under a mountain of printouts nobody had thought to distrust. The trouble started 2 mornings later when a junior engineer named Pruitt, who had been quietly reporting back to Gordon Reyes since the week he was hired, walked into the testing bay early and found Daniel making an adjustment to the compressor stage with a torque wrench that clearly didn't belong to company inventory. Pruitt photographed it on his phone before anyone noticed him standing in the doorway, and he had it forwarded to Gordon's office before his coffee had even finished brewing. By that afternoon, Gordon had convened an emergency session of the board, and Claire found herself standing at the head of the table, defending a decision that, on paper, she hadn't been fully authorized to make. A janitor is not authorized to physically alter a $3 million department prototype, Gordon said, his voice carrying the calm, patient tone of a man who believed he already had the votes. I don't care what corner of a problem he happened to stumble onto. This is a liability exposure the size of this entire company, and you have let it run for 4 nights unsupervised. He identified a manufacturing defect that 12 licensed engineers missed entirely, Claire said. I have the diagnostics right here to prove it, time-stamped, verified against the original specification. Then let one of those 12 licensed engineers apply the fix under his supervision, if his theory holds up. Fire the maintenance man today, Claire, or I will do it myself before this meeting ends. Claire held his gaze across the table without blinking. If you fire him, Gordon, you're firing the only person in this building who's gotten this engine within reach of running at all. That will be in these minutes, right next to your name, when the department asks why the program collapsed. The room shifted, uneasy, chairs creaking, and Gordon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he didn't push it further, not with the full board watching him weigh a threat against a woman who had just made the entire room remember, plainly, whose company this actually was. He folded instead, or seemed to, his voice smoothing back over into something almost reasonable. Fine, he said. He stays, but the demonstration for the department investors happens in 4 days as originally scheduled, no extensions granted for any reason, and if that engine is not running clean by then, both of your names go in the file, yours and his, together. Daniel heard about the ultimatum secondhand, from Walter, standing in the hallway outside the testing bay with his hands jammed in his pockets. He didn't say much in response, just nodded slowly, absorbing it the way he absorbed most things, without letting it show on his face where anyone could read it. That evening he went home and Lily met him at the door in her socks, sliding across the hardwood floor, asking if he wanted to see the volcano she'd finished building for the science fair. He read construction paper lava spilling down its papier-mâché sides. He sat on the kitchen floor with her for an hour, letting the baking soda eruption run over twice, cheering both times like it was the first, and for that hour, the ultimatum simply didn't exist anywhere in the world. Later, after Lily had gone to bed, Daniel sat alone at the kitchen table, with the leather notebook open in front of him for the first time in 9 years. He read through his own handwriting like it belonged to someone else, a younger man who had believed back then that being the best in the room was worth almost any price. He wasn't sure anymore if that man had been wrong. He only knew that man hadn't had a 9-year-old asking him to watch a volcano erupt twice, and that changed the math on almost everything. Walter had not slept well in 3 days. He kept turning the notebook over in his mind, the name he'd recognized, the 9 years of silence that name had earned in an industry that talked about almost nothing else if it was interesting enough to gossip about. He thought about his pension, about the 18 months he had left until retirement, about how easy it would be to simply say nothing and let the demonstration happen or fail on its own. He thought about that for 3 days and didn't like the man he saw himself becoming in the thinking. On the morning of the 4th day, with the board reconvened to review final preparations before the demonstration, Walter stood up before anyone had called on him and asked to speak, his voice a little unsteady at first, and then steadier as he went on. There's something you all need to know about the man who fixed this engine, he said, and the room went still in a way it hadn't gone still all week. His name isn't just a name stitched onto a maintenance badge. 9 years ago, Daniel Ashford led the propulsion team on the department's Talon 9 program, the highest efficiency turbine design this country produced in a decade. I know because I spent 3 years trying to find out what happened to the man who led it. He didn't leave the industry because he wasn't good enough. He left because his wife was dying, and his daughter needed a father who came home at night, not one who was classified somewhere over the Pacific for months at a time. The silence in the room had a different texture to it now, heavier, more attentive. Claire sat very still, absorbing it, watching the pieces she had half suspected click quietly into a shape she hadn't let herself fully believe until this exact moment. Walter wasn't finished. He set a second folder on the table, thinner, more deliberate. And there is something you should also know about why Mr. Reyes wants this program to fail. I've spent the last 2 weeks going through the vendor correspondence more carefully than I probably should have. Mr. Reyes has been in private negotiation with Sterling Aerodyne to sell off our entire propulsion division, contingent on this department contract collapsing. A failed demonstration isn't just bad news for him. It is precisely the outcome he needs. Every head in the room turned to Gordon Reyes. He opened his mouth to answer and, for the first time in anyone's memory, nothing useful came out of it. Claire found Daniel in the testing bay an hour later, standing over the engine that was, for the first time in 10 days, fully reassembled and gleaming faintly under the work lights. She didn't say anything about Gordon, or the board, or the vote that would surely come. She asked the only question that actually mattered to her right then. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" Daniel wiped his hands on a rag, slow, giving himself a second before he answered, choosing the words the way he chose everything, carefully. "Because the last time I was that person, I missed 2 years of my daughter's life to time zones and clearance levels I couldn't even tell my own wife about. I didn't want the recognition, Claire. I wanted to be home for dinner. That's the entire reason I took a job in this building that nobody would ever look at twice. You could have told me. When I gave you the 48 hours, you could have said something then. Would it have changed the 48 hours? Claire didn't have an answer for that, not right away, and the honesty of the question sat between them longer than either of them expected. She looked at him for a long moment, and what passed between them wasn't anger anymore. It was something closer to recognition. One person finally seeing another the way they had actually been standing there the entire time, unnoticed and complete. "No," she admitted quietly, "it wouldn't have." "Then I'm not sorry I waited," he said. "I'm only sorry you had to hear it from Walter instead of from me." With Gordon's leverage broken and the board's attention now split evenly between the demonstration and the growing scandal around Sterling Aerodyne, Claire moved fast, faster than she'd moved on anything since taking over for her father. She named Daniel interim lead engineer for the remaining 4 days, and the 12 engineers who had signed the original failure report found themselves, somewhat uncomfortably, working under a man who 3 days earlier had been fixing their light fixtures. There was resistance at first, quiet but real. A senior engineer named Castellano openly questioned in a staff meeting whether a facilities technician had any real business directing certified aerospace engineers with advanced degrees, his arms crossed, his tone carefully polite in the way that wasn't polite at all. Daniel didn't argue with him. He walked him through the tolerance stack failure on the compressor blade instead, step by step, with a precision that made the objection quietly evaporate somewhere in the middle of the explanation, Castellano's arms slowly uncrossing as he leaned closer to see the mark on the metal for himself. By the second day, the resistance had turned into something closer to attention. Engineers leaning in during Daniel's morning briefings instead of checking their phones under the table, a few of them taking notes for the first time in months. He was patient with the ones who genuinely wanted to learn, and short with the ones who only wanted to be right. He showed a young engineer named Priya how to feel for imbalance in a spinning shaft, with her palm flat against the housing, the way you'd feel for a fever on a child's forehead, before you ever pulled up a vibration chart to confirm what your hand had already told you. "The chart tells you what already happened," he told her. "Your hand tells you what's about to." By the third day, the 12 engineers who had signed the original failure report had stopped introducing themselves as the ones who'd signed it. Castellano, still stiff with pride but no longer arguing, stayed 2 hours past the end of his shift without being asked, cross-checking Daniel's tolerance calculations against the original manufacturing specs simply because he wanted to understand, for himself, exactly where 12 trained engineers had all looked in the same direction and missed the same small thing. He found Daniel in the break room afterward and set the confirmation printout down without a word, and Daniel read it, nodded once, and said, "Good work," and that was the entire conversation, and it was enough. Gordon, cornered but not yet finished, spent those same 4 days working the angles he had left to work. He drafted an email to the department's lead investor, questioning the qualifications of the man now overseeing the demonstration, framing it carefully as simple due diligence, sending it from a personal account so it wouldn't trace back easily to company letterhead if anyone ever asked. Claire found out about it from an assistant who forwarded it to her by accident, thinking it had already gone through proper channels, and she walked straight down the hall and into Gordon's office without knocking. "You tried to sabotage a federal demonstration to protect a private sale you were never authorized to negotiate," she said, setting a printed copy on his desk. "I have the email, I have Walter's vendor correspondence, all of it. dated and verified. If you say one more word to a single investor before Friday, I will personally make sure the department sees every page of this before you finish the sentence you're about to start." Gordon didn't answer her, not with words. For the first time since she'd taken over for her father, he looked at her the way you look at someone who has, without quite announcing it, become the one actually running the company. She left his office and stood in the hallway for a moment afterward, her heart still going fast, and realized she wasn't shaking from fear. She was shaking because for the first time in weeks, she had said exactly what she meant to exactly the person who needed to hear it, and it had landed. Her father had told her once that the job wasn't about being liked in that room. It was about being right in it and being willing to say so out loud. She understood, standing there, that she finally believed him. The night before the demonstration, the bay was quiet in a way it hadn't been all week. The frantic energy of the previous 4 days settled into something calmer, more finished. The engine sat complete under the work lights, every panel closed, every reading steady and green on the test bench display. Daniel and Claire stood a few feet apart, watching it idle, listening to a sound that had gone from a stall and a shudder to something almost musical, low, and even, and sure of itself. Neither of them said much. There wasn't anything left that needed saying out loud between them. Claire looked at him once, in the low light, in a way she hadn't quite let herself look at him before, openly, without the careful distance of the last 2 weeks, and he caught it, and neither of them looked away first. Gordon made one final move that evening, sending an email to the full board informing them that regardless of tomorrow's outcome, he intended to formally propose the sale of the propulsion division at the next shareholder meeting. It read less like strategy now, and more like a man refusing to admit, even to himself, that the ground had already shifted permanently underneath him. Lily called at 7, same as always, the sound of the television faintly audible behind her. "Are you coming home for breakfast?" she asked, and Daniel told her yes, whatever happened tomorrow, he'd be there in the morning, pancakes, same as always, no matter what. He set the phone down and looked at the engine, then at Claire standing beside him. "First time in 3 years, I've felt like myself again," he said. "Not because of any of this, not the board, not the title, because I stopped hiding the parts of me that used to matter to who I actually am." Claire didn't say anything to that right away. She just stood beside him a little longer than she strictly needed to before she finally gathered her things and went home. The demonstration bay was full the next morning. Department officials seated in one row with tablets and clipboards, Whitfield's remaining board members in another, Gordon Reyes seated near the back with his arms crossed like a man attending his own funeral and pretending otherwise. Claire stood at the front, steady, in a gray suit she'd chosen specifically because her father used to wear one just like it to every major review. Daniel stood by the control console, where a facilities technician had no official business standing, and by that point nobody left in the room thought to object. The engine came up to speed clean through the first 90 seconds, the sound building smooth and controlled. Then, at 80% thrust, it shuddered, a rattling vibration that ran visibly through the housing, and the room went rigid all at once, pens stopping mid-note. Gordon's mouth curved, just slightly, just enough for Claire to catch it from across the room. Daniel was already moving before the vibration had finished its first pass through the frame. He didn't reach for the diagnostic tablet. He pulled a small adjustable wrench from his own coveralls, the same one that had fallen out of his toolbox with the notebook 11 days earlier, and he made a quarter turn on a bleed valve access point most people in the room didn't even know existed. His hand steady, unhurried, certain. The rattling smoothed into a low, even roar. The needle on the thrust gauge climbed past 90%, past 94, and settled at 96, 2 full points higher than the original design specification had ever promised anyone. The room broke into applause before most of them had fully processed what they'd just watched happen in front of them. One of the department officials leaned over to another and said something with the word remarkable in it, twice. Walter stood up in the noise and asked the lead investor for 2 minutes of his time, no more. He laid the sterling Aerodyne correspondence on the table in front of the entire board, plainly, without embellishment, and let the documents speak for themselves the way good evidence always does. By the time the applause for the engine had fully died down, the room's attention had turned entirely to Gordon Reyes, who sat very still under the weight of every eye in the building, his arms still crossed, no longer looking like a man attending a funeral so much as a man watching one being dug for him in real time. One of the department officials, a quiet woman near the front who had said almost nothing all morning, finally spoke. "Mr. Reyes," she said, "would you like to respond to any of this before we conclude?" Gordon looked at the folder, then at Claire, then at Daniel standing calm and unbothered by the console, and he said only that he had nothing further to add, his voice smaller than anyone in that room had ever heard it. The board called an emergency vote before the investors had even left the parking lot. Gordon Reyes was removed as chairman that same afternoon, the vote nearly unanimous and the outcome so certain that even the two directors who had once been reliably loyal to him didn't bother raising a hand in his defense when the moment finally came. He left the building an hour later, carrying a single box of belongings, and nobody stopped working long enough to watch him go, and the engineering wing already humming with the ordinary business of a company that had survived something. 3 weeks later, Whitfield Propulsion Systems announced Daniel Ashford as its new director of engineering, a title that arrived with a corner office he rarely used because most mornings he could still be found down in the testing bay, sleeves rolled up, hands on whatever engine needed them that particular day, the same as it had always been, just with better lighting now and his own name on the door down the hall. Lily came by the shop on a Saturday morning in October, backpack over one shoulder, and the 12 engineers who had once signed a report saying the impossible engine could not be fixed greeted her by name without hesitation because by then, everyone in the building knew exactly who her father was and had long since stopped needing an introduction. She sat on a stool by the workbench doing homework while a small crowd of engineers argued cheerfully over the merits of a new turbine design nearby, and nobody told her to be quiet or to move along out of the way. Claire arrived a little after 9, with 3 coffees balanced carefully in a cardboard tray. One of them a hot chocolate she set down in front of Lily without being asked, the whipped cream already starting to melt at the edges. She had learned that much about the family over the past month. Small things, the kind that mattered. Nobody made any announcement about what she and Daniel had quietly become to each other in the weeks since the demonstration. There was no speech, no declaration made across a desk or a boardroom table, just 3 cups of coffee set down on a workbench on an ordinary Saturday, and the easy, unhurried quiet of 2 people who had already said everything that mattered to each other without ever needing the words for it out loud. Daniel reached into his coveralls and pulled out the small leather notebook, the one that had started all of it falling out of a toolbox in the middle of an empty bay 11 months ago, and he set it down gently on the workbench in front of Claire. "You never actually looked at this properly," he said. "Might as well now, if you want to." She opened it slowly, careful with the worn pages, and the morning light came through the bay windows and settled warm and unhurried over all 3 of them, over the coffee going lukewarm in their hands, and the engine humming quietly on the test stand behind them. Finished now, ordinary now, no longer anyone's secret to keep. Lily looked up from her homework long enough to ask if she could keep the hot chocolate cup, and Claire told her she could keep the whole tray if she wanted it, and Lily grinned and went right back to her worksheet like it was the most natural thing in the world. 3 coffees and a 9-year-old's homework spread across a workbench that had once held nothing but a report declaring an engine unfixable. Somewhere behind them, one of the 12 engineers laughed at something Priya said, and the sound carried easily through the open bay, ordinary and unremarkable, the kind of sound a good morning makes when nobody in the room is hiding anything anymore. Neither of them had been looking.